Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our Moving People Forward session and doing systemic racism through equitable planning. I imagine many of you are glad you're not traveling to this conference this morning, and give us a shout in the chat if you joined us last year and remember scrambling home during that snowstorm. Chris, my colleague Chris, and I were driving home in the BC Sprinter van. It was quite scary, but this morning I went for a lovely walk with our membership manager, Eric, and we came close to doing snow angels, and it was a really lovely start to the day. We hope you have had one too. I'm Mo McCann. I'm the Education and Safety Director with Bicycle Colorado. If you've attended other sessions, you've seen me busy in the chat and so obnoxious that they promoted me to moderator. I'm kidding, that's not how I got here this morning. We've been planning this session for a while now, and I'm really honored to be here with our great panel. To start, let's review how we're going to engage through Zoom. We didn't receive any language requests, so you won't see that feature, and you have your video and audio set to off. Unlike an in-person conference where you wouldn't be talking to your neighbor or passing notes during presentations, virtual is great because the conversation isn't one-sided, and we can be learning from each other at the same time. So let's get started by having everyone introduce yourselves, where you're joining from, and be sure your chat is set to share with all attendees so we can see each other's names and where we're joining from in Colorado or outside of the state. And we encourage you to generously engage throughout the presentation and discussions through the chat and the Q&A feature. We're going to continue the practice of starting our session with a land acknowledgement. Because of moving people forward, we must not only talk about the future, but acknowledge the past. Our team is reserving this space to recognize and honor the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations who were the original occupants and custodians of this land for centuries before genocide and ethnic cleansing led by white settlers. We're grateful to these communities. They're living descendants in Colorado and descendants of those forcefully relocated here for their wisdom and resilience in both the past and present. It's critical that we keep in mind the connections between transportation and these American Indian communities. Everyone in this virtual room travels and recreates on stolen lands. Many of us choose how we get around and the impact we have on land. And many of us also make decisions on transportation systems and how land is used that further influence our community's footprint. And while our fields often discuss freedom of mobility, we must also acknowledge the right for people to stay in place that was taken from American Indians by colonizers. So thanks to everyone for honoring these people and their land with us this morning. We'd also like to thank our sponsors who made Moving People Forward possible. We have our presenting sponsor, Lyft. Thanks for their support, and our champion sponsors, Quality Bicycle Products, People for Bikes, and Colorado Bike Law. And finally, for this specific session, our session sponsor is Gates Carbon Drive, which is very fitting considering we're highlighting Oakland's bike plan. And we'd like to refresh ourselves on the norms for these sessions. And thanks already for honoring these norms in our other sessions throughout the last 2 weeks. We will be present and actively listen, generously share your thoughts, ideas, and questions in the chat, assume best intentions of each other, challenge your assumptions, seek to understand new, different, or constructive perspectives, expect and accept non-closure, lean into any discomfort, and hold yourselves and each other accountable to these norms. We hope you've enjoyed meeting our storytellers at the start of each session to help us acknowledge the human impact that transportation systems and the decisions we make have on, and share the experiences related to the panel topics. And today we are excited to introduce Julia Burciaga. She is a Montbello community member and co-founder of a local bike group, Montbello in BC, or Montbello on Bike. The video does have subtitles, and in case we have limited bandwidth or any issues or delay today, we'll continue to post our storytellers and the panel recordings on our session slides and webpage, our sessions and slides webpage, so that you can take a look after the session. So let's go ahead and hear Julia's story.
Me llamo Julia Burciaga y vivo aquí en la comunidad de Montbello, en Denver. Lo que hace que mi comunidad sea especial es la unión del vecindario, especialmente los vecinos, y hace que eso hagamos amigos muy fácilmente y seamos muy unidos. Bueno, pues hay 3 opciones. La primera, pues yo pienso que la que más usa la gente es el carro, porque es más rápido y seguro. En segundo, el camión, porque pues también es una forma de llegar más rápido. El tercero, pues es la bicicleta, pero todavía hay gente que no se siente muy segura debido al tráfico y a que no hay suficientes rutas para poder andar en bicicleta y poder llegar de un lugar a otro, especialmente si andan con niños pequeños. Cuando andan las personas mayores solas, pues sí es más fácil poder moverse en bicicleta. Pero lo ideal sería que pudiera haber más carriles para bicicletas y me imagino que así más gente podría andar en bicicleta. Desde que era joven me gustaba pasear en bicicleta y aprovechando la situación de COVID, esto me impulsó a seguir adelante, invitando familias para salir a pasear y lo que me gusta de ella que podemos salir en familia. Me siento muy feliz porque puedo conocer nuevos senderos y sobre todo que andamos en familia y con amigos y eso me hace muy feliz. Lo que impide que más personas anden en bicicleta es el tráfico y que eso impide que se realicen más carriles para poder andar en bicicleta, más personas. El Club en Bici es un grupo que se formó el año pasado y empezó con un pequeño grupo invitándolas a salir a pasear y ahora no solamente salen niños sino también sus papás y ahora salimos más en familia. Para mí la importancia es el poder salir más en familias y a la vez inculcarles a los hijos la importancia del ejercicio. Y la bicicleta es un ejercicio muy bueno que ayuda no solamente a los niños, sino también a nosotros como padres. Pues para mí la importancia es sentirme orgullosa de los logros que yo misma hago y ver que puedo crear un grupo, no solo chiquito, sino que lo puedo ampliar para formar más gente que se una a nuestro grupo. Cuando ya se forma, pues nos hacemos todos amigos y eso es la importancia para mí. La unión porque se va formando más unión en el vecindario. Los cambios que he mirado que ha crecido y ha habido un poco más de apoyo hacia la comunidad debido al COVID, y los bienvenidos, pues especialmente esos que hay organizaciones que nos ayudan para pequeños proyectos como y los que no son bienvenidos, pues el alto costo de las viviendas que debido a eso muchas familias han tenido que irse de aquí. Que tomaran más en cuenta la voz de la comunidad y nos dieran un poco más de apoyo para cualquier proyecto que uno quisiera realizar.
Thanks, Jack. We're big fans of Mount Bello in BC and the momentum that Julia has built, and her story gave us a lot of examples of the community's passion and persistence and their needs as they navigate the inequitable impacts of planning. So I'd now like to invite panelists to turn on your videos, and I'll introduce each of you alongside this intro slide Today, we're going to look at Oakland as a case study and explore the process and the dynamics across the city, consultants, and community as they challenge traditional planning systems. So we have Manuel Corona, a transportation planner with the Oakland Department of Transportation. Keita Price is the Director of Urban and Regional Planning, also known as the Hood Planner with the East Oakland Collective. And we'll share a link in the chat so you can get to know Keita and her organization a little better. And then Jeff Knowles from the consultant side, a principal and Oakland office manager with Alta Planning and Design. And an extra thanks to all of you for waking up bright and early to join us from the West Coast. And then we also have in our own time zone active mode specialist Nick Hyman, who's going to share how the city of Fort Collins is championing equitable engagement, planning, and implementation, as well as reflect on what we hear from Oakland that we can apply here to Colorado. So thanks for being here, Nick. And as we've done previously, we'd like to know who's with us today. So if we could take a quick poll. It is anonymous, and we'd love to get to know you a little better, and also your presence in previous MPF sessions. So we'll take maybe about 30 seconds. And again, this is anonymous. You should see that poll right in front of you. And we'll have our Zoom tech folks, once we see a majority of attendees submit their responses, let's share that out so we can all see who's joining us today. Awesome. Wonderful. So we've seen some pretty consistent attendance across the other sessions. We hope you've enjoyed them. We see some, wow, it's pretty balanced, a lot of advocates, but pretty balanced across different fields and professions. Thanks BC members for joining us. We see 86% of us are white, and I think that's a great reminder of the disproportionate representation in the field of transportation, and a reminder of who traditionally has had power in this space. And then it looks like most of you are fresh and new to the Let's Bike Oakland plan. So we're really excited to introduce it to you today. We saw this and thought it was one of the most holistic and community-centered plans that we've seen. And since then, I've learned that the city of Oakland and their partners in the community are doing even more authentic planning work. And so we're excited to hear about that. So because we have systemic racism in our panel title, we want to take a minute to define it and provide some context through this statement on the next slide from CDPHE. I'll read it for the group. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment acknowledges that longstanding systemic racism, including economic and environmental injustice, has created conditions that negatively affect marginalized communities, particularly people of color. These conditions, which limit opportunities for optimal health and influence individual behaviors, are critical predictors of health outcomes. To realize a future where all Coloradans can thrive, we must be leaders in undoing policies and practices that have contributed to these injustices. So systemic racism, again, is the way policies and practices are designed that give an unjust advantage to people who are white and unjust disadvantage to people of color. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the context in this statement of the phrase marginalized actually suggests that being marginalized is a part of a community's predetermined identity, when in fact it's systemic racism that marginalized Black, Brown, and other communities of color. So in transportation, we see the harmful impacts of systemic racism in displacement of Black and Brown communities to widen highways, like I-70 here in Denver, and the air quality impacts these expansion projects have. Limited bike and ped infrastructure in these communities that make them more vulnerable to traffic violence, and disproportionate traffic stops and profiling of people of color as they travel through public spaces. And these mobility barriers then compound inequities by limiting access to education, jobs, healthcare, food, and physical activity. So we encourage you to share your own definition or examples in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Keita, Jeff, and Manuel to share about their bike plan and the transformation and collaboration they've seen since. So I'll hand it off to you all. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to start us off and then hand it off to my colleagues here as I move forward. And just to start off, I'd love to give some background on ODOT. The Department of Transportation in Oakland is actually fairly new. It wasn't developed until 2017, and the bike plan provided an opportunity for us to think about planning, long-range planning in a different way, and ensure that we're listening to community voices and see how we can best accommodate the needs and challenges that people are feeling in Oakland, as opposed to traditional planning methods that had been done previously within the department or within the other departments. Next slide, please. In order to do this, we had a new approach where we started with a representative survey that was statistically significant and reflective of the demographics that we see in Oakland. We not only had an equity framework that helped guide the plan and recommendations and engagement, but we started by doing a bias training with our consulting group and within our own team here in Oakland to ensure that we all had the same language and understanding of how we wanted to move forward within the plan. With that, we included new engagement strategies, one of which was partnering with the community-based organizations to reach unrepresented communities. And we also tried new outreach strategies such as online tools, mobile pop-up workshops to really ensure that we're meeting people where they are already, as opposed to asking them to meet us downtown at times that doesn't work for them. Next slide, please. Excellent. And then to start off, this is our framework. Our equity framework was really guiding us around these three questions below, as asking ourselves, what are the most vulnerable populations that we see in the city? What decisions or what desired conditions and well-beings does the city and residents want for Oakland? And how can we implement the plan while working towards these conditions? We use these set of questions to guide our process along to ensure that we reach and are looking at our 4 goals, which are access to health and safety, affordability, and collaboration. Next slide, please. And then the most important thing I think that came out of this plan was our paid partnership with our community partners and organizations who showed not only the demographics of Oakland, but also we reach those hard to reach communities, particularly youth and underserved neighborhoods. So we partnered with Bikes for Life, Cycles of Change, the East Oakland Collective, which is represented here today, the original Scraper Bike team, and Outdoor Afro to ensure that we were touching base across all city neighborhoods and ensure that we're hearing from the right neighborhoods. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to talk about some of the data we found through the plan.
Great, thanks, Manuel. Next slide, please, Chuck. So, as Manuel described, it was a really comprehensive outreach approach, and I was just privileged enough to be leading from the consultant side. Some of the outcomes in terms of numbers of people we reached: 3,600 people engaged through over 60 community events and meetings. We had 1,300 people on our mailing list, and OCDOT logged over 576 hours spent out talking in the community at all of these events. We also had an online presence with a web map, 2,300 different comments on our web map, giving us feedback about routes and ideas for programs. Next slide. We did a statistically significant survey, and that helped us also understand people's preferences and needs in Oakland. And this was significant not only at the citywide level, but we did it by 10 different geographic zones in the city to make sure it was truly representative. We found some really interesting stories in that survey. We found that 29% of Oaklanders biked in the last month, which is a statistic that is way beyond what we get from the census information. We also found out that 57% would like to bike more often. And so this is part of our first phase of outreach, our what we call listening phase. This all told us a couple of key things. We heard about enforcement policy by the Oakland Police Department being a barrier to some people bicycling more often. We heard about the need for separated bikeways and the issues with separated bikeways, especially losing parking in some areas where that's critical. We heard about prioritizing youth and really building a culture of bicycling or reinforcing that culture early on so they can have those great positive experiences. We also talked about a transparent process. There was a lot of distrust going into this plan between government and some of these communities. And so we wanted to make sure that this process was one that was built on trust and collaboration. Next slide, please. Our second phase of outreach was collaborate. This is truly where we were going with the community to design different bikeway facilities. In this image here, you can see this was one of our design workshops. We had an all-day come as you are and help us design different bikeway signage, pavement markings, and also review some program ideas. Next slide. And then our final phase is refine. This is where we went and captured more comments on the online web tool about different routes that we're planning. And we did a series of bike rides. This is with the Scraper Bike team out there, taking residents and youth through some of the routes that we were working together to define, and that helped us refine that. Next slide. Some of the key things, strategies that came out of this plan, I'd invite everybody to take a look at it. It's online. You can download it and read more about the process and the outcomes of that plan. But we really put an emphasis on non-infrastructure programs, and there's a chapter on it. Some of the key community priorities that came out of that were promoting hometown efforts, so recognizing and helping and reinforce the cultures that already exist, the bike cultures that exist, and giving them what they need in terms of financial resources. The second thing is providing shared resources, so that could be bike tools at Oakland libraries so that people can fix their bikes themselves. There's not a whole lot of bike shops in Deep East Oakland, and so we wanted to provide those resources directly in the community. And then also support the local bicycling economy, finding ways that you could do trainers, you could build more resources, human resources in the community to become, for people to take part in that bike economy in East Oakland. Thanks, that's all from me. I'll turn it back over to Manuel.
Thank you. And I would just like to emphasize that this programmatic element of the bike plan really pushed the needle within OCDOT to rethink how we do planning aside from infrastructure. Prior to this, we were just striping lanes, making sure that we have safe intersections, and we're addressing those concerns from a data design or a data point. But now in the last, since the plan has been adopted, I've really seen the needle within the department where there's been a change and a shift to programmatic elements and finding funding and new approaches to ensure that, Oakland, what we heard a lot was Oakland residents, particularly in East Oakland, are going to bike regardless if the infrastructure is there or not. So really focus on how we can do the wraparound services to support some of that infrastructure while we're building it out. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Keita and talk about the community approach and how they've been able to engage with us since.
All right, cool. Thank you, Manuel. What's up with everybody? How y'all doing? I'm Keita Price, Director of Urban and Regional Planning for the East Oakland Collective. Before I jump back into the Let's Bike Oakland discussion, I'm going to give a little bit about who EOC is and who East Oakland is. Next slide. And then discussion outline, yes, intro. We more than just a disadvantaged community. Give a little overview. So I'm gonna talk more high level about how we've gone from different equitable processes and how it's evolved over each time or not, and what improvements or challenges or best practices we could talk about using certain case studies. Next slide, please. Cool, the East Oakland Collective, EOC. We are a member-based community organizing group invested in serving communities of Deep East Oakland by working towards racial and economic justice. We're millennial-based, millennial plus, where it's not just millennials, but that's how we started out because we felt like we was the group that wasn't really being served, had a lot of energy. We're gonna be out here, but didn't feel like it was a lot of services and things for us to do. So we created it on our own. Our founder, actually, Candace Elder, right here in the middle, founded it. Next slide, please. And so our focus areas are civic engagement and leadership, economic empowerment, homelessness services and solutions, and our very new area is neighborhood and transportation planning. Even though it's formally new to be listed here, we've been doing it since day one. I'll talk a little bit later how like the Let's Bike Oakland contract was our first paid contract. And so since then we've been like in the lane of transportation and climate. Next slide, please. Cool. So before I get into talking more about the planning of things, just want to ground you all a little bit more on who East Oakland is. So more than a disadvantaged or marginalized community, yeah, we're East Oakland. As you can see, if you look on the map down to the lower right corner, you see Deep East Oakland. I had to type it in because the map, I got this map from our Visit Oakland website. And so they only showcase the neighborhoods that's deemed economically and socially vital or whatnot. And in my area, it's historically not been seen as that, sometimes way before my time. But since my 30 years of being here and after the war on drugs era, it's been seen as just an area ridden of crime and just need to be redone without the existing people. And so next slide, please. So yeah, before we talk about numbers and statistics, just want to show you who we are. Yeah, we are the people. We are people. The residents of East Oakland are the greatest assets to me of our neighborhoods. And so our people, our culture, our dance, we influence all across the U.S., even not just the U.S., but the globe. We have notable people from our neighborhoods like Damian Lillard here, NBA player. We have, again, leading folks in the dance culture and just great food. Because we have such a diverse demographics of people, you can come here and probably try almost any food. Next slide, please. And so a little bit more about the culture of how people move in Deep East Oakland. Just in everybody, I guess, here knows mobility is, but just for a little definition, mobility is the ability to move or be moved freely and easily. And so like, how do we do that in East Oakland? We do that in a lot of different ways, but no matter how we do it, you feel me? We do it with swag. We do it with style. We do it, you feel me? We do it. So whether we walking, we skateboarding, whether we protesting not because of George Floyd, we've been dealing with systematic and recognizing systematic racism and oppression in our neighborhood forever. So, but George Floyd, re-sparked the conversation. So even if it's us dancing through the street to not protest, but to uplift and rally around the fact that we're still here, and to let residents see each other and know that you still have somebody here that look like you, that supports you. Or if that's just a scraper bike team riding down the block, you feel me, just doing what they do. However we move, again, we do it with style. Next slide. So now I'm gonna go into like an overview of the efforts towards equitable community engagement in East Oakland and kind of how, again, it's evolved over time, how I feel like, this is my opinion, and how it's evolved over time. Next slide, please. Cool, so before I get into that, just briefly wanted to mention EOC's approach to equitable community engagement. I'm gonna spend less time on the strategies and what we actually did. I have a bunch of links that you can look at that to get a better visual of how we do engagement, but just to ground you in our principles and how we approach it. So we like to build relationships, so meeting residents where they're at. In this age of COVID, that means socially distanced and doing that how we best can, but building relationships is key. Just because we're from the neighborhoods, born and raised, 3 generations, doesn't mean that we know everybody and can represent all the different diverse perspectives, even if they are the same demographic and class and age. Creative and culturally relevant, we really pride ourselves on, sorry, same slide. Creative and culturally relevant, we really pride ourselves on relating to our demographic, relating to the people that that we actually serve. And again, just because we're Black doesn't mean that that's automatic. Sometimes we might have to, again, educate ourselves if it's a certain group that we're not familiar with, social group. And participatory planning, we value residents as key stakeholders and advocate for their involvement at every part of strategic and management processes of urban planning. Ooh, cool, I gotta go fast. Okay, next slide. All right, Let's Bike Oakland. So you heard a lot about Let's Bike Oakland. I'm gonna just say here briefly, again, it was our first contract. It was the first time that we had known for CBOs to be invited on the onset of a planning project. I'm gonna say transportation planning project because I don't want to speak for every other department, which I'm kind of confident that it is. But yeah, it's the first time it was onset at the beginning of the project. So we got to more so not be the end thought, but more so in the beginning. And so while that is an improvement of where we've come before of being engaged at the very end to check a box, it still has some improvements to be made. So although we was engaged at the beginning, like this plan was mandated to be done. So it's not something that the community got to say, we want to spend the next year or whatever prioritizing bike lanes. Like if somebody would have came to us and asked, we probably wouldn't have been like, let's do that. We probably would have did something else, but it has to be mandated. And if you're going to come in East Oakland, we feel like we're the best ones to help you facilitate that. And so just want to raise the point that yes, we were there in the beginning and we were able to get funded on time without having to do the reimbursement processes, thanks to the third party consultant, Alta. And that was a big thing for us. Again, that was our first contract. We wasn't on salary, so we couldn't get our money after we did the work. So I just want to stress that that was really important and key, and that's an improvement that the bureaucracy had to figure out, because every consultant is not going to have the money to front that. Next slide, please. So moving on, East Oakland's response to slow streets. So this is kind of like this is not really part of my presentation, but it happened like in terms of my talk. But the East Oakland response to slow streets kind of just happened. And it's an example on how, like, what was not equitable engagement. So everybody know COVID happens, and you're probably familiar with the idea of slow streets or open streets. And so in Oakland, it was kind of just done. We get a lot of praise for being first to do it, but it was done just kind of abruptly and a one size fit all to the whole city. And so, yeah, in East Oakland, it was kind of like not in my hood, and not just to be combative, but because it was no proper signage. This right here is the Go Slow, It's Essential sign was in other neighborhoods. I never seen this sign in my area of East Oakland until after us bringing awareness to the fact that the sign looked nothing like, only looked like the ones at the bottom, which was just a man and some sign saying don't come through. So people were just going through the streets like, because it wasn't adequate signage or anything. So just wanted to point out here that although Oakland get praised for their being first to implement slow streets, in Deep East Oakland, we had an issue in how they didn't do proper community engagement to actually see if those blocks wanted that on their streets. But long story short, we end up meeting unpaid, adding it to our workload or whatnot, and trying to troubleshoot how they actually enter or do not enter East Oakland. Next slide. Sorry, I gotta move a little bit faster, so sorry if I'm rambling. And this is just some testimonies from Instagram on how folks didn't appreciate how slow streets was rolled out. I'll read one. Any program that blocks streets should be fully discussed with residents, including discussing the possible aftermath of the changes. I'll just stop there. But again, people was not happy. Next slide, please. And so Let's Bike Oakland was about, what, almost 4 years ago now. So as we're still trying to implement, and that's another thing, yay, we did the plan, but implementing is a whole nother thing, a topic that we, for another day. And so while we're simultaneously still trying to uplift and implement stuff from the Let's Bike Oakland plan, we're now currently ending our East Oakland Mobility Action Plan. And so we're moving a little closer to now, you know, us kind of choosing our priorities. Still wasn't completely chosen, but a step closer. So MTC had some money to do a community-based transportation plan. And the East Oakland Collective were asked to lead the engagement. And we were like, if we're gonna lead engagement, we need to prioritize East Oakland. We're not about to engage all of Oakland. That's not what we do. And we feel like if you want to provide true equity, then you should be focused on East Oakland, or we're not, because you haven't for a long time. Long story short, we got the project to be focused primarily on Deep East Oakland. And we basically want this plan to help us identify ways so that everybody can have access to and choices within a local and regional transportation system that is safe, efficient, and affordable, and connects them to the places they need to thrive. Next slide, please. And so here's just a little bit of the pictures of our community engagement. And while you look at this, I'll kind of just talk about again how this is different from the Let's Bike Oakland. Again, so we got to kind of shape it because not only did we get to shape it as a community, we had help from ODOT at the time, had comprehensive, had a Black planner named, well, they had a Black planner, I won't go with names. And she was very, again, culturally conscious of our demographic, not because she wasn't from Oakland, but she was culturally conscious of us, and made it made it to where that she really sorry, I'm emotional about this topic, so I'm trying to get through it, sorry. Long story short, a Black planner was the PM of this project to start out. And so that helped, and not just because she was Black that it worked so well, it's because she understood true equity and inclusivity. And so we did a lot at the beginning of the project to ground it and set it to a certain thing that we felt comfortable actually leading. And then for whatever bureaucratic reasons that I can only imagine, Brittany was not let go, but her contract wasn't extended or whatnot. And she fought a lot internally to funnel funds to East Oakland for the past 3 years of her being there. So for her to just get cut out the project, like right in the beginning, or like right when we were about to get going, that we was already having distrust with the city of Oakland. And then we thought that ODOT was a little bit better because they was younger and new, but then this happened. So it was like, God damn, we made this beautiful plan. We thought we took some steps forward, and then we get here. So it's not just enough to check a box and create a plan. Like now we're luckily we had a great alternative PM as Manuel Corona, and again, luckily he's great and culturally relevant as well. But the fact that they just cut off our PM that we was comfortable with, that recognized our community, that doesn't show true equity. So then that comes to raise questions about ODOT's hiring and retention practices. So I'll move forward from here, but that's what I just really want to raise, is that we had got the opportunity to create the project as we wanted because we had the proper staff to support us in doing that. And then when they got let go, it's just like, it kind of went back to kind of checking the box. But Manuel is great. So he's doing the best to keep it the integrity as we wanted it from the beginning. But again, now we got to have these long discussions again about now how we in another situation of mistrust and how we're going to move forward, because we have a lot of more stuff to do together. Moving, next slide. Sorry, I'm gonna get through. And so that was that. And so now, closing out, we're getting to the East Oakland Sustainable Transportation to Martin Luther King Jr. Shoreline project. So we're finally now at a project that we chose and prioritized and found funding for, even though he wasn't the lead applicant of the funding because of bureaucracy. We chose this project. We were a part of the Resilient by Design Challenge, where we had first started identifying issues with transportation to this beautiful regional shoreline. And so from 4 years ago, from that project to the East Oakland map, from Let's Bike Oakland to the East Oakland map, we've been carrying this idea, or not idea, but uplifting the issue of lack of access to the shoreline. So now after East Oakland map, we've chosen to identify some funds to do a feasibility study. Next slide. So we got some CARB funds to do a feasibility study to see if folks really want this free zero emission shuttle to go on loop from inner deep East Oakland down to the shoreline. Because right now we are buried you got to get past BART, the train system, Amtrak, and the old school train system, freight train. And so it's just not really accessible. And so again, this is something that we chose that we wanted to do. We're the lead project managers, even though City of Oakland, ODOT is the lead on the grant. We are completely managing this project and they're supporting us. And so we're just to want to say, we're getting closer to the community being able to lead the priorities and what we want to do and spend our time on. Next slide, sorry. And so, sorry, I know I probably went over, but in closing, what has worked is reaching out to CBOs as early as possible to participate in planning processes. So that, I will say that the city has caught on at least to that. So they contact us a little earlier, can do better about other folks than the main people that they know, try to expand that a little bit. Third-party consultant fronting the cost for CBO labor, that is working, but it probably always won't work because all third-party people don't have the money to front it. And I say what's also working is empowering CBOs to lead and manage a process. We've shown ourselves, I did mention one planning process that we were a part of called EONI, East Oakland Neighborhood Initiative. We actually, EOC, co-project managed that. So we've demonstrated ourselves to be able to lead these processes. And so I feel like, yeah, we're getting empowered to do so more since we've demonstrated that we can. And how can equitable engagement be improved? I think we need to budget for restorative justice strategies to mitigate or address conflict between community and local government. When we have issues with the either public sector or public government, like again, we be wanting to bring in elders and mediators and things like that, and we wanted to go through healing strategies together, but it's unpaid for us. Y'all on salary, but most of the time it's unpaid. So budget for that restorative justice if we really want to get there. Empower CBOs to identify and manage which projects should be prioritized for implementation, because then we'll be more invested. Local government being accountable to equitable and inclusive hiring practices that retain culturally relevant planners for our communities. And that is all for me. Thank you all. Thank you, Jeff and Manuel, again, for all the work that we've done together, and Manuel, that you continue to support me with.
Thank you so much, Oakland team. And Kita, you were getting a lot of love in the chat. Planning is personal, and I think we really appreciate you sharing that perspective. And this whole group had some really candid conversations in our planning call, and I think we'll probably see some more of that across all of you partners in Oakland when we get to the discussion. So feel free if you want to dig in more to those questions and recommendations that Kita gave in the last slide. Let's see some more of your questions come through. And I'm going to hand it off to Nick with Fort Collins, and we have his presentation that we'll share as well. And take it away, Nick.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Good morning. It's nice to be here with you. Certainly, many thanks to the Oakland team, Kita in particular. I think throughout our brief time together through our planning calls, I've learned more about the work that Oakland has been doing, and really hope that through this conversation we can really begin to, as the title of our session here is, undo systemic racism through equitable planning. Next slide, please. I'll keep it pretty brief here. I think that we'll have a lot of value in the conversation, but I do want to tell a little bit of a story that where the city of Fort Collins has been on our equity journey. I'll start a little bit with just some of our COVID response and how that really highlighted and brought to light some of the equity gaps in our service delivery and in our program, and some of the groundwork that we have been doing and laying early on so that we can start to make progress towards improving equitable outcomes and equitable program development. A brief look at what some of what we hope Fort Collins may look like from a programmatic standpoint in the future, and then finally spend most of the time here bringing back some equity lessons that we can integrate here in Colorado. Next slide, please. So, of course, COVID was everywhere, and in Fort Collins, we certainly felt that on the operations side of things first. Our bike share and scooter share systems were modified and reduced, and of course, we saw a reduction in fees entirely on our transit system, although our transit system, of course, was limited in capacity, which we still are facing some struggles in regaining the lost ridership that we saw throughout the course of the last year. On a programmatic element, our outdoor dining program, as many other places, I wouldn't be surprised to learn, our outdoor dining program really took off. In fact, we're starting to enacted a framework very nimbly and quickly in order to establish a framework for moving forward and how to safely engage and support our local businesses, related specifically our restaurants. And we, at this point in time, anticipate that we'll continue that, reimagining the use of our public spaces, especially in our downtown area, into 2021 and beyond. Remote work, of course, became an important component to resilience in the pandemic. Of course, we certainly acknowledge that remote work doesn't work for everybody. In fact, there's some massive inequities that I think need to be addressed in remote work and telework programs going forward. Nevertheless, we also saw bringing a lot of our other more traditional programming, such as our EV programming and some of our bicycle education programming online. And then some of our major events, our signature public engagement events like Bike to Work Days and Open Streets, were canceled in an effort to kind of reimagine what that could look like. I certainly Kita's point resonated with me that the slow streets concept, while it worked in some places, it certainly requires a much more contextual evaluation to make sure that that program works for each community. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic really kind of highlighted so many of the inequities that maybe were just simmering right below the surface. And it also sort of highlighted some of the problematic processes that we as city staff had been engaging in. Citywide coordination was spotty. However, it's growing. We certainly have champions in individual program areas and departments who are committed and devoted to continuing to embed equity into everything that they do. But we really were lacking and continue to lack that citywide coordination, but that's changing. We still found ourselves in a very siloed approach, working just within the people that are primarily in our programs or our departments, and then within our service areas too, or groupings of departments. We're starting to make some progress there in breaking down those silos. And then I think perhaps most importantly is the lack of equitable discussions and weaving equity into every conversation has historically been missing. Next slide, please. So we've started to lay some framework. I think that the point of bringing up some of the COVID response in Fort Collins was really to highlight the fact that so many of our original programs we had to scrap, break all the way down and rebuild if it was worth rebuilding. I think that's a critical question to ask. Is it worth rebuilding? In some cases, we have not re-implemented some of our programs, and instead we've opted for more coordination. So we've established 4 coordination meetings. These meetings are within our program area in our department, where we get people into the same room in order to talk about specific topics and strategize together. At this point in time, we hold biweekly equity coordination meetings and biweekly outreach coordination meetings. We're engaged with police at Colorado State University, as well as the city police, in order to discuss coordination with those entities, infrastructure coordination, and then I think most significantly has been some interdepartmental collaboration, largely around some really significant projects. Our Climate Future is our update to our climate action plan and really centers on an equitable engagement process leading with race. Our Equity Indicators project is something forthcoming where we hope to put a dashboard for the public to access, showing information specifically on where inequities are in our community. Shift Your Ride is another programmatic effort where we're working to launch focus groups to engage the Latinx community. And then the Housing Strategic Plan is another great plan that's coming together that's really centered in equitable engagement. Next slide, please. Just to touch briefly on where we hope Fort Collins goes to some degree. This is certainly not all inclusive, but we certainly hope to have a more equity-focused micro-mobility program with reduced fees and a better connection to transit. We also have begun to look at an internal audit of all of our programs in a way that we can determine which programs could have a better connection and a stronger emphasis on equity and which ones don't, and then really turn that into an equity work plan so that we can strategically evolve our programs. Continue to bring EV programs and promotions online, as well as throughout the community through more equitable engagement as well, really bringing that program to historically marginalized and typically under-resourced populations. We're also working on organizational-wide knowledge building, including some exploration around what it might look like to incorporate mandatory trainings throughout our organization. And then finally, we're actually have a green light from our leadership to begin the recruitment for an equity officer, an executive who will lead a brand new office on equity, where we really hope that role will be bridging the gap between the grassroots efforts that's working in the organization with the grass tops. Next slide, please. We'll focus the next 2 slides, I think hopefully are some of the biggest key takeaways. A lot of these next 2 slides are pieces of advice that I think are really important in starting to embed equity more specifically into our programs, and also things that I've learned from conversations with community members, and then even some of our other peers like Kita and the folks from Oakland. I think to start, one of the most important things that we can all really begin to adopt is a different worldview. I think that starts by preparing a mentality that's needed for success in equity work, and those include some key traits like being curious, being open to learning, openness to input from people, and especially from people who haven't been at the table to begin with. And then listening not only to our peers, but to the community members, bringing a table to them, with more seats. I think that could be literal as well as figurative, but actually bringing more people into the conversation and listening to what they have to say. What are their barriers? What are the needs that they have? What does their lived experience have to offer in the planning phases of any given new project? Another worldview I think that's important for us to begin to adopt, especially as municipal staff, is to begin to realize that the city could be considered the entity that provides resources for CBOs or community-based organizations to achieve their goals. I think all too often the status quo, especially in municipal organizations, has been to say, these are the staff that have the ideas and the skill sets, so we're going to advance those ideas. And in fact, I think we should shift that and focus on identifying the goals of our community members and using our resources to help connect or to help them reach their goals. Also, this idea that perfection isn't the goal to start. I've seen in many instances that concern about not being perfect and concern about making mistakes actually hampers the very beginnings of equity work. I think the goal rather should be to start with the right intention and the absolute commitment that each and every time we're going to do better. I think we can recognize and anticipate mistakes that we'll make in this space, but know that each time we're going to do better. We're going to talk to more people, and we're going to revise our processes every time. Moving into some more specific topics, individual champions, those could be people like me who work in specific departments within the organization. They could be connections to community members and people outside of the organization. The point is that individual champions are needed to influence every single conversation that they're involved in. There are ways that we can bring in equity and talk about equity in our conversations that can really have an impact on the direction of a project and the culture of an organization. I think the next bullet point, technical assistance, is really important for us and has been a big eye-opener in that we have to be honest with ourselves that, one, we don't know what we don't know, and two, there are other resources outside of the organization or maybe even within the organization that can help us do a better job in our planning and in integrating equitable engagement into those processes. If you're not that person, then seek out technical assistance. Reach out to your CBOs and other entities within your community. I'm sure that there's people who can help. And if you are one of those people who feels comfortable and confident talking about equity and leading in this space, feel free to offer it. An hour-long conversation to anyone in your region could change the course of a project. Also look for opportunities where we can do things better and be honest with ourselves. I think, and I'm certainly the first to admit that when we own a specific process, it can be hard to say and identify areas where we can change and do things differently. I think it really takes a lot of courage, especially as the owner of a process, to be vulnerable in the sense that we might be scrapping an entire process the way it's been done. Next slide, please. Again, one more heavy slide of kind of technical bring it homes, and then we'll wrap it up here. I think another really important piece that we're starting to get involved in at the City of Fort Collins is integrating equity criteria into project prioritization and into funding criteria. So we're starting to have conversations about how do we score and weight projects, particularly capital projects that might be occurring across the community. How can we weight those in a way that prioritizes the redeployment of resources to communities and regions of our community that have historically had the least amount of resources deployed, but also being mindful that in some cases, just putting in all these projects into places that have been historically underserved could come with unintended consequences, such as environmental injustice. So again, this is a complex system that requires a lot of scrutiny throughout. Also on the topic of budgeting, at the City of Fort Collins, we typically do a biennial budget process. We're in a little bit of a different situation right now with the pandemic, but we're starting to have some conversations about how can we score particular budget offers around equity and how might that impact the overall budget conversation. Equitable engagement, of course, this I think is the most important component, but who you talk to, how often you talk to them, and the types of questions that you ask, I think really makes a big difference in the trajectory of a specific project. Kita talked so much about this, and I think we all have so much more to continue to learn about what does equitable engagement look like. I think another really important critical piece, the Oakland folks talked about this slightly or briefly as well, but trainings with staff on the common topic of equity and language. I should have probably even mentioned this before too, but when I talk about equity, what I'm referring to is the deployment of resources, more resources to the people who have historically had less resources. And I think that getting everyone on the same page about what these definitions are that we're using and what the language is that we're using makes all the difference. That should be happening on a regular basis within our programs and within our departments. And I think it also should be happening, as the Oakland folks suggest, at the beginning of each of our projects so that we can check our biases, knowing that all of us have biases, whether we know that or not, and start to develop some skills so that we can continue to move forward in this space. With technical assistance, also learning how to and offering that help so that we can build capacity so that staff can lead their own equitable projects. I think that's really where a lot of our work within our department is right now, is building that foundational capacity. And then finally, I mentioned the equity indicators, but beyond that, I think we're really committed to broadening our focus and specifically making sure that we're including the differently abled community members within Fort Collins in our conversations around equity as well. Next slide, and this should be the last one. Special thanks to so many people in the city of Fort Collins who are passionate and devoted to equity. 3 of them, Amanda Mansfield, Morgan Turner, and Bree Corbett, work very closely with me. But there are so many other people in this space that are really out to make a difference, to do something that's bigger than themselves. And it's an honor to be a part of the work that they've been doing. So with that, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. And if anyone is interested in those last couple slides where Nick shared a bunch of really great specific and high-level suggestions and recommendations, and also Kita's slide on recommendations, let us know and we'll make sure to share those. I have a ton of questions. We've got some great ones in the Q&A, but wanted to start by handing it back to Manuel and Jeff to speak a little bit in response to what Kita shared. You clearly have a strong or a respectful, a good working relationship that has evolved over time. And Kita, you described some peaks and pits with your relationship with the city. So Manuel and Jeff, I'd love for you to share a little bit about your responsibility in this process and building those relationships and building up, back up some of that trust. And I'll let either one of you start, and then we'll get to some of the Q&A as well.
Jeff, I don't know if maybe you want to start and then I can respond to both.
Yeah, that sounds fine, Manuel. So, you know, I think it was from our perspective, it really was the leadership of OCDOT, the city of Oakland. They walked in, they had a clear goal for this plan at the outset, that they wanted to center communities that have not been part of the planning processes in the past. And so that was kind of our mandate to make that real. And so our job as the consultant lead, and we were part of a team that included Transform, which is a nonprofit that works in the Bay Area. They really helped manage a lot of the community outreach alongside us. Tool Design Group was part of our team. EMC Research, which did the survey. There was a large team, and then we added the 5 CBOs as paid partners with us. The way that we tried to frame that at the beginning was having individual meetings with them, having roundtable discussions to really frame out what are these outreach events going to look like, to make sure that there was a lead CBO really taking ownership of each of those. So EOC had the very first meeting at the Boxing Club in Deep East Oakland. They facilitated the meeting. We were there to record. We asked them, what resources do you need? We presented, we prepared the posters, the maps, and really we were there to listen. And I think that helped set the tone for the rest of the activities, where our job was really to try and absorb what we were hearing and then reflect that back and start to build that process of trust of listening, bringing it back and saying, here's what we heard, here's what we're proposing, and then getting more feedback. And so it's this virtuous loop of building that trust. And really the proof was in actually implementation, like Keita said. A plan is only as good as if the city is going to put the resources together to implement that. And I'm happy to share that there have been already some projects implemented that came out of this plan. The city of Oakland just applied to implement a network of bike boulevards, which is a big priority for the Scraper Bike team for biking all throughout East Oakland. And that right now has been funded at the tune of $17 million by the state of California to implement a bike boulevard network. So that's my perspective. And, it was a pleasure working with Keita, with EOC and all the CBOs. We learned a lot from the process. And hopefully we were just good stewards of the planning process.
Thank you, Jeff. And I want to commend Alta as well. They were extremely flexible and adjusting and accommodating to not only the needs of OCDOT, but of the community specifically. I know a lot of times when we do these task orders as consultants, they're very scope oriented and really focused on what's in the breakdown of there, but they were creative in working with us to adjust to what was really needing and to accommodate those as we moved along through the planning process. And kind of to respond to Keita's concerns and ups and downs with the city, I myself share the same concerns and up and downs with the city as well, and I really have seen us evolve and recede a lot in our responses to equity, both in the city and also, or both out facing in the community, but also within our organization. We have a Department of Race and Equity for the whole city that looks at ensuring that there's equity embedded in all our processes, but specifically ODOT has been like at the beginning to create our own, let me post it in the chat, to create our own racial equity team that has subcommittees that have been working on creating new equity tools, new standard operating procedures around how to do engagement, data analytics to see how we're moving forward as a plan. And these are really guiding us on all our planning efforts moving here on out. And I'm part of this team. And really what I've learned is that my role in the department has shifted more away from being the planner that does the street design and does the high range planning and informative, but really I become like the middle ground between an interpreter for community and for officials within the city. So really distilling and ensuring that community voice and particularly underserved neighborhoods are prioritized in our planning efforts moving forward, and then vice versa, as I hear from our city officials and leadership about what their goals and approaches are, that I'm also communicating that to community so that everyone understands and we're being transparent about what we're doing and that we're not siloing our projects and trying to be more as a united front, more Oaklanders as a whole, as opposed to just community. We touch base once and we leave them, and then we move on our planning effort, specifically around the bike plan. As Jeff mentioned, we did just receive some grant money, and I'm making sure that our implementation team, which is a different team than mine, is still reaching out to the organizations that we partner with to ensure that they know what's happening and ask them if they want to be part of the process as we move forward. And as my team, I'm on the project and planning development team. So I'm kind of at like the grant funding and the conceptual level funding. So I really have the opportunity to ensure that equity is embedded in all our planning processes that we have going on. Unfortunately, as a person of color and as like a younger staff person in ODOT, I also suffered from the loss of people on our staff who were leaders and forefronts of what equity means and how to truly be inclusive. And I try to learn from it as much as possible, but still those are even hindrances within our own staffing that kind of like have created other levels of barriers that we're trying to overcome, that I'm trying to overcome as I move forward to ensure that our values, my values are the same, and that I'm holding leadership to our strategic goals, right, which is trustworthy, transparent, accountable governments, and trying to embed that in the work that I do, of course, with the support of community members such as Kita. I hope that answered the question.
That was great. Kita, are you unmuted? Do you want to share anything?
No, I'll wait for another question. I think they shared. Yeah. And I just thank everybody for, you know, letting me be vulnerable in the space. Yeah, planning is personal. I'll be forgetting sometimes. I got into this work just because of how it impacts my life, not because I didn't even know about planning until I heard about gentrification. Then I did the reverse learning to learn city planning and wanted to become that because I'm like, oh, okay. I was tired of protesting and being an advocate in other ways, a student advocate. So I was like, I want to become a planner so I can help plan and design my city.
Absolutely. And there's more of that in your bio on your website. So I encourage people to go and take a look of that process that brought Kita here. I also want to point out, we've mentioned the Scraper Bike Team. I shared a video, and I think that there is a corridor also that's called the Scraper Bikeway, or I don't know if that's officially what it's called, but it's a corridor going down the center of the street, the road, which is not something we usually see. And I think something that communities sometimes are frustrated by is needing to stick to the rules and not doing things differently or outside the box when it's really what the community needs or is asking for. If anyone wants to speak briefly to that, and then I'm going to transition to a question for Fort Collins that Oakland might have a response to as well.
Cool. Yeah, briefly, the Scraper Bikeway, it is a middle lane bike path. So like Manuel has said early on, ODOT is trying to, we've been pushing and other people have been pushing ODOT to think more outside of just doing the technical improvements that need to be done under some of these plans. So for instance, the paving plan, they have a paving plan that was kind of behind schedule for like years. So, and then they decided to get back on schedule and wherever they left off at. And a lot of where they left off at was in East Oakland. And so now I'm picking back up, instead of just, now we're in an era of the community, we are up, we're aware, we're planning our own stuff. So now for you to just come in and repave a street is just like, kind of like, yeah, old thinking. And so the Scraper Bike Team actually led, EOC just supported the Scraper Bike Team in voicing their concerns and desire to explore having a bike lane a different way, because the paving plan was just gonna come in and restripe and, like he said, just stripe and pave and that's it. And they was probably gonna do it based on some kind of model from some other higher income neighborhood or area of Oakland that doesn't necessarily fit East Oakland. And so Champ did a lot of work. Champ is the CEO and founder of the Scraper Bike Team, and executive director. And so, yes, he was just adamant. And at the time, the planner that I mentioned was let go. She also helped that initiative to happen, to make sure that happened or whatnot, and was adamant that we can't just pave, we can do programmatic stuff and we can design in a way that's culturally relevant for the community, because they're gonna ride in the middle of the street anyway. So you might as well design it like that to make it a little bit safer for everybody. And the project still has some safety improvements that it needs to increase signage and things like that. But yeah, ultimately it was a sign of ODOT actually listening to the community and trying to do more than just pave and add programming. And it was also showing how community members are like CBOs and community individuals like Champ from the Scraper Bike Team, like, yeah, we know we want. Like, we know we want in our community, and it's like, just give us the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, and to that point, like technically ODOT can't call it a bike lane, we call it a multi-use lane, just because of, you know, so, but it is the Scraper Bikeway, and the big thing about that was honoring the culture out there of center riding lanes and ensuring that we were listening to what people wanted and what they were going to use the streetwise on. Another thing that I think has been a roadblock that I've seen is a part of the build up of that was to create intentionality and ownership around this street, since it was repaved and redone. And with that, the planner who left us had devised having monthly 90th Avenue cleanups every month to ensure that community members could come up and like lift up their own neighborhoods. And that kind of dropped off at the end of COVID. And it is kind of outside of ODOT's wheelhouse. So I've been trying to figure out how can we still keep that like empowerment in the city and have them have ownership, because a lot of times bike lanes are seen as a sign of gentrification, and the center running bike lane on 90th Avenue was a way to try to shift that mentality away from bicycle infrastructure in East Oakland as we start to build out the network.
Awesome, thank you. I think a lot of what we hear sometimes is communities feeling like this infrastructure is not for them. It's for people who may be moving into the community post displacement, and a corridor like that and getting that community involvement and perspective and having them really guide that design, I think is really incredible. It's great to see. Nick, there was a question for you in the chat around language and the shifting language, specifically around victim blaming towards cyclists, but I know that, and you responded to that. I know that your team is really intentional about the language you've defined. You've come up with some foundational language that you're going to use consistently. And just for something for Oakland to think about too, I just am generally curious about the language, your plan, how it's written, how even how it's designed to not just be for planners, but also for community. If this is a plan that is to design and to plan a community, how are we making sure that it's digestible, or that the audience reading it, that it is that it's also for them and not just this internal document, and whether that's through imagery or really specific language, or like Hida mentioned, making sure we're not just describing the marginalization of these communities, but also celebrating their strengths. All of that. Nick, do you have any thoughts? And then Oakland team.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that language is so important. Something that I've been thinking about for at least the past year is that old phrase, that old adage that sticks and stones can break my bones and words can never hurt me, and that's just not true. I think we are recognizing now more than ever, and I think we're late in recognizing the fact that language really does matter. From an accessibility standpoint, one thing that we're starting to do with our Climate Future program, our update to our climate action plan, is making sure that we use anti-city speak is what we're talking about. Language that we have to go in, and especially as municipal staff, it can be a big challenge for us, I think, to go in and actually pull out all of this information. In fact, I saw some of the chat, early on, defining some of the acronyms and things that we were using, and I think it's just a constant reminder to me that accessible language is so important. I think one way that we have really done that with our Climate Future, and how I think we can do that going forward, is to co-create our definitions with our historically marginalized community members. If we're going to talk about what does a specific word mean, what does equity mean, for example, just for sake of argument, I think that we should be defining that with our community members so that we hear what they think this means, and continue to go through an iterative process where we may take some definitions home to work on internally, and then to continue to check with the community member and say, does this make sense? Community members, I should say. It's not just about one person. I think it's about a lot of different people. But continuing to check that language with them and say, did we hear you right? Did we get this right? Or what can we continue to do differently? I think one other piece that is really important, I think in general, but specifically talking about language and in equity work, is that we all have to get ready to plan for so much more additional time than we ever thought we needed. And I think that that's one thing. Perhaps this is a resource that I can pop in the chat too if I can get to it. But thinking about how does white supremacy manifest itself in our workplaces, in our everyday institutions, and one of those ways, whether we know it or not, is through the use of the language that we use. So to bring it all home, I think that co-creating the definitions, the language that we're using with our community members is the most important, especially the community members that have not been at the table to begin with historically, and to continue to cycle through iterations to check with them. Did we hear you right? Did we get it right? And if we didn't, then commit to coming back and doing that again.
Quickly, I just want to add that another strategy I think is relevant, and what I've learned through my racial equity teamwork is the need to have a representative staff that is working with community and to ensuring that hiring practices are reflective of that within our departments, so that people feel like they're being heard and that they're being understood at the same relevancy. I know as a Mexican American or as a Chicano, like I like to tell myself, I don't always feel comfortable speaking to the white planners in my office sometimes because I don't think they understand the perspective in the same way that someone else from my background would as well. So I think that that goes a long way to ensure that as you build plans and you're going out there in community, that they can see themselves reflected in the people that they're talking to.
Thank you. I'm going to take another Q&A question and kind of broaden it a little bit. So the question was for Nick around people, we've been talking about bikes a lot, right? But transit as well, people who may use transit as a space to be when they may not have a house or a place they call home. And also thinking about when it comes to bicycling, core riders who ride out of necessity. And so I would love any thoughts from Fort Collins or Oakland about how to engage and hear from those folks. And those of you who joined us last Tuesday night where we talked about redefining safety, Director Chantel Lewis of our RTD District B shared a little bit about her concerns and how she prioritizes those people whose basic needs are not met, and how through transportation and transportation planning, we need to keep them top of mind and how we can serve them. So any perspective from either the folks who depend on transit sometimes for more than just transportation, and then who depend on their bikes for transportation because they don't have a choice otherwise.
This is a really good question, and I admit that I don't think I did justice in answering that, nor do I think I'll do justice in answering it right now either. I think this is, I think that people who experience homelessness in all of our communities are often too overlooked, and I think that I'm one of the first to admit that that is just something that I've really overlooked. I think especially on this equity journey that we've been on, it's been perhaps helpful, perhaps protective in a sense, to be thinking about engaging, a specific group at this point in time. And that certainly does not leave the door open at this moment in time to being inclusive, to thinking about other populations and how our decisions might impact them for positive or probably for negative. It's also interesting that you kind of asked this question, because this is like, when I get off of work, then my mind just kind of starts thinking about all these other things. And in fact, engaging with people experiencing homelessness has been something that I've been thinking about, like when I'm off the clock, as it were. I would imagine that some of the approaches that we have used in engaging other historically marginalized community members, such as hosting a variety of opportunities to engage with them where they are. So actually going to the places where they live, to the places where they're recreating, where they are spending a majority of their time, and engaging them there, I think can be one of the first most important steps. But I'll kind of leave it there, as I certainly recognize that I've got a lot more to learn in this particular space. And I'd be curious if our friends from Oakland have anything else to share.
Yes, this is a question about the young transient, how to engage the young transient community with no CBOs around. Yeah, I don't know how that is. It's like we have a saturation of CBOs out here. So yeah, it sounds like you're starting from scratch. But I don't know if it's funding. So for us, it's a little different because we have the EOC, we have a whole homelessness and services solution. So we serve transit, we have a whole area that serves the transit community, all ages. And so when I want to engage that community around certain planning topics or whatnot, so we have a whole food distribution. Before COVID, it was only bi-monthly, and then we did hot meals maybe twice a week when we got the funds. But now since COVID, emergency funds have ramped up, so we scrapped the bi-monthly because socially distance is hard. But we feed hot meals 5 days a week or whatnot, and not just to the transit community now to all low income folks within our boundaries, Brown, Latinx, everybody in the area. So we try to align our efforts with what we already do. So since we already do food distribution, we got a certain amount of bags that's going out every day. So I'll start stapling stuff to the bags and whatnot to get the community to know. But I think what's most helpful is just to pop up where they're at. I know the comfortability around doing that is you got to get there. Again, me from being here, is some areas I'm not as comfortable with, especially since I don't work in that area of the org. But since I'm from here, it's some areas that I feel very comfortable with and talking to anybody. But I would say try to get some other young folks. It would be great if they're young transient folks as well. But if not, just other young folks, if you can get some money to pay them as ambassadors to help you pop up where these and meet these folks where they are. Yeah, if you got to talk to them on the go when they walk in, if, you know, just making an exchange though, you know, we never come. That's what I just learned about from being a Black Panther Cub. I just really realized that not coming empty handed, like just coming to ask for information is like exhausting. And we're fatigued with community engagement, honestly. So we really have to get more creative, and people are just more willing when it's an exchange, not just an extraction of my information to you.
If I could add a little more to that, Keita, I think that's excellent. And as we have started to work more closely with some of our local Indigenous groups, that's this idea of reciprocity, that we need to offer something to these community members if we're going to expect that they give something back to us is really important. I also think that something that I haven't even talked about today is compensation, and how important it is that we compensate our community champions and our community-based organizations for the work that they're doing. An adage that we continue to use in Fort Collins and have been for a long time is this idea that we continue to over-survey and under-deliver, specifically when it comes to our Latinx communities. And we have got to put a stop to that. And I have been pretty vocal in making sure, and there's other colleagues too, even just yesterday, somebody else brought this up to the point that we need to be cautious when we over-survey, and if we're going to be asking community members for their input, first of all, pay them for their time. And if you can't do that through your organization, then find a way to do it. And one way that we have found to make that more plausible is to work with the community-based organization in order to make that happen. When this whole idea that asking for something and not expecting to give something, even beforehand, I think can go a long ways in starting to establish trust, and starting to open that door to making trust maybe a little bit more of a reality. And I think I've got this thought in my mind, and I'm not finding the right words to say it right now, but that our historically marginalized and typically under-resourced community members, the people who we have not historically been talking to, have so much to offer, and yet we cannot be asking them to offer that to us for free. It doesn't work that way anymore.
Nick, let me take that a step further and talk about how does it get operationalized in a planning process with a consultant team. This is one way that OCDOT found it to be the case. I know they're working on other direct models with creating like an on-call bench. I know our MPO in the Bay Area is also creating an on-call bench. The problem with that is that governments are not really nimble at creating these contracting relationships. And so there's a lot of things about insurance requirements, about pay when paid. And so you have to get reimbursed, which could take, some cities are very good. Sometimes things get backed up and you could go 90 days, 120 days without getting an invoice paid. So for an organization like Alta, we're medium sized. And so we can float that. We've got enough cash flow that we can pay our staff and wait for those invoices to come in. Some CBOs don't have that flexibility. They need to get paid up front for their work. And so what I think worked out well for us was we set up a separate contracting relationship with the CBOs where they get paid 40% upfront at the very beginning when we got them under contract, 40% at the midway point, and then 10% at the completion of their services. And it was all percent complete based. So it was just those three invoices. It wasn't tracking all the hours and trying to come up with really complicated invoicing. And so that was something that we could take on. We waived all those insurance requirements. We assumed all that liability as an organization. I think that added a little bit of flexibility so that we were able to get the CBOs what they needed, get them the cash they needed so they could do their work, but then take away all of the bureaucracy. So that worked out, I think, well for us, but it's an ongoing process. And I think that's something that still needs to work out across all governments.
Thank you. That was a fantastic extended response. We got into a lot of things there, and I want to thank all of you for being so active in the Q&A. We got through so many questions just by you all responding there, and feel free to revisit because I know more than one person might have thoughts on a specific question. But in the last, we only have about 4 minutes, and we are wanting to close these with kind of an action item or a to-do that someone can take away right now. And so I'd love for each of you, from your perspective or your role, right, whether it's city, consultant, or community, what is one thing that you would advise someone in a similar role to do, or what could they do to help them advance equitable anti-racist planning through that role? So let's start with Manuel at the city.
I'm so sorry, I was responding to a question. Do you mind repeating that question to me?
That's my fault because I assigned you something and then I assigned you another thing. Keita, let's start with you. We're just responding to someone in your role who is listening right now. What would you advise them? What advice would you give, or an action item that they can do to get this process rolling or start that momentum going? We know it's a tricky system to change.
To get it going, I would definitely start with, I'm not sure what everybody's municipality system is, but really start with the planning department or whatever the sector is, but the planning, and yeah, just addressing them to let them know, to getting acquainted with that department and building a relationship to let them know your priorities so that you can be on their radar. That's kind of how EOC did. Besides our social media, that's very noticeable. It was just us. I was everywhere. I was everywhere for a minute. I didn't know, like I said, I learned gentrification, and like in a year later, I declared myself a planner, or well, not 6 months later, declared myself a planner. So I was just putting myself in everything to where that they couldn't get around me after a while. So yeah, I would say be consistent, you know, make yourself known and seen in certain places, not in an annoying way or where it's like not effective, but like show them that you're there and you're prepared. And even if you're not completely prepared yet, just let them know that, you know, you're paying attention. So I feel like the city of Oakland couldn't ignore it after a while. It was just too in their face. So just stay consistent, stay grounded in what you want, and keep pushing.
Absolutely. Awesome. Manuel, back to you.
Yes, so as a government perspective, right, would be to slow down your process and to build in longer timelines to ensure that you're giving and allocating the appropriate amount of time to listen and learn and adjust your flexibility in your plans and your project processes. And go back as many times as it goes. Remember, people evolve, and we got to evolve with them. So anything we do is like a moment in time. And if your plan takes longer, maybe it's time to revisit that moment in time and go back. But really building that into your timelines. I know sometimes we're constrained by timelines, so buffering it. I think that all my timelines, I push out by another month just to ensure that I'm providing that extra space. I don't always use the whole time, but I'm glad that it's there. And then it's a win if I finish early.
Awesome. Jeff, and then Nick, will wrap up with you.
I think from a consultant perspective, you need to have a new shift in mindset that you're not there to provide all of the answers. You're there as a servant, and your job is to serve a process that lifts up voices and make sure it reflects those needs. So it's a lot about letting go of the power that I think planners a lot like to hold on to. We've kind of taken that and held on to that, especially I think for us white planners out there, white male planners, and talking to you. We've got a lot of work to do internally to think about how can we shift our role and step back and take a back seat to this work while still adding value. So it's a long ongoing process that's going to take lots of iteration. Don't be afraid to make mistakes and just keep seeking understanding and working with partners across the different areas, city government, nonprofits, work internally with your organizations. A lot of work to do.
Thank you, Jeff. And Nick.
I think that was an excellent way to end, Jeff. I would also add that in addition to what Jeff said, particularly for white municipal staff among us, I would also say that start to look at, and I accidentally just shared it with Mo. I meant to send it to everybody, but it's a document that I have found really helpful. in helping to identify how white supremacy manifests itself in our workplace cultures. I think starting to get familiar with what that might look like could be really important and a really important first step. And I would say, to go further, start to do this work on your own. I think we have so much work to do that really starting at home and really taking it upon yourself to start to become familiar with what are the typically minority populations in your area? What types of CBO organization do they have or do they not have? And start to understand how you could perhaps unintentionally be pushing white supremacy without even knowing it, and how that it might boil over and impact all kinds of different segments in our populations.
Thank you so much, Nick. We're going to bring up the presentation again, and I did reshare the resource that Nick shared with me privately. I shared it with the whole group. And that's something that our team, Bicycle Colorado and the Denver Streets Partnership, have also broken down and looked at those characteristics, and we encourage everyone to be doing the same. So we want to thank you for attending. We do, I think, have one last slide that we've been closing each session with, because we have an exciting bike raffle going on. We've got 2 bikes, the one on the left, a road bike for $100 a ticket, and the one on the right, just $7 a ticket. If you're excited to get a new ride this season, throw your hat in the ring. And then just a final thank you to our panelists, again, for being so active, our attendees, our audience for being so engaged and active as well. And we hope you learned a lot. Reach out to us if there are any additional resources that you didn't catch. And hope to see you this evening for our session, Creating Shared Mobility Systems That Work for Everyone. That's our closing session, and Pete, our executive director, is going to be moderating that one. So one final thank you to everyone, and we hope to see you back here tonight.
Yes, thank you all.